Hi y'all, this is part 4 of the series I've been doing from my book, Equal Protection Under God. I've been reading excerpts from it. Today I'm not going to necessarily read excerpts from my book because today's chapter will be chapter 3, and the title of this chapter is Sexual and Physical Abuse. This chapter, and there are some other parts in the book as well that contain some stories and some of my experiences working with sex trafficking victims, working with domestic violence victims, and sexual assault victims. And so this chapter, and there are a few other parts in the book that could trigger some victims of that trauma and some survivors of that trauma. So I do want to be sensitive to that, and I do want you as the readers to understand that there are some real life scenarios in here that could be triggering. But I want to talk to you a little bit about why I included this chapter in my book and why I talk about this. But before I do that, I do want to read the scripture that opens the chapter. And it comes from Amos chapter 5, verse 24. But let justice roll down like waters. So we have heard a lot in the last several years about Me Too, about women who have been sexually assaulted and are coming to light. We've also heard a lot over the last few years about women in the evangelical churches who are coming out, speaking about their abuse at the hands of clergy, at the hands of other ministers within the church or other church leaders. And for a large part of those women, those situations, no one took them seriously. No one investigated. The woman was made to feel, she was gaslighted, or she was made to feel unworthy, or she was kicked out of the church. There are a lot of things that have happened that were not right. A lot of churches have not handled these abuse allegations in a way that is helpful to the victims. So as I put in my book, a lot of times the church is more of a refuge for the perpetrators rather than a place of hope and restoration and healing for the victims. And so I'm hoping that by including this chapter in my book, I bring some light to it. In this chapter, I talk about the rape of Dinah. If you've never heard of the story of Dinah, it's found in Genesis, and it's an account of one of Jacob's daughters who was raped. We don't hear much about Dinah. Dinah is really within that story in Genesis. It starts out talking about her, but then she becomes a subscript to her own story. And what I want to draw attention to is women are not subscripts. In Dinah's story, and which is covered in the book, her brothers take on the responsibility of seeking vengeance. But they're angry with what happened to her, really the dad, really what happened to Jacob, to Israel, not necessarily what happened to Dinah. We don't hear from Dinah. After the rape happens, we don't hear anything from Dinah. We don't know how she's feeling. We don't know how she's recovering. If her brothers were concerned about Dinah, they would have been going to Dinah and rescuing her out of the situation rather than going and seeking vengeance on the entire town for what the one man did. And so I want to contrast that to another story, and I think this is where we in the church and society as a whole, but I think this is a problem that we have. We know more about the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, who made the false allegations of sexual assault or attempted rape, than we do about Dinah, who was actually raped. I'm not going to try to explain or even come up with reasons as to why that happened. I want to draw attention to the fact that so many church leaders and people within the church are quick to think more of someone making a false allegation of a rape or sexual assault or attempted rape than they are to believe the person who are making those allegations. Now, certainly, I've been working with abused victims, and within this field of trafficking, sexual assault for over 20 years, yes, I have seen some false allegations. Those numbers are few and far between. The vast majority of people who make allegations are telling the truth. So I want us to examine why we are so quick to think more of Potiphar's wife and making a false allegation than we are to think about Dinah, and why we don't recognize the trauma that Dinah suffered and other victims. And particularly, I want to bring attention to the fact that even within Dinah's story, as I said earlier, we don't hear from her. She's silent. As many victims have been, she was silent, and we don't hear from her. And I want people to hear from Dinah. I want people to hear from victims, because I have seen the trauma and the harm that it causes women when we are devalued, when we are not believed. Women are not a subscript. Dinah was a subscript to her own story, her own trauma, but women are not a subscript. And that's one of the purposes of writing this book, is to draw attention to the fact that we are not subscripts. We need to be heard, we need to be listened to, and we need to be believed.